Drinking alcohol is a nearly universal phenomenon. Alcoholic beverages exist in almost every culture in the world. And those who did not bother to invent them, the peoples of North America and Australia, were colonized by those who did. A complete history of human relations with alcohol would require setting out the entire history of mankind. There simply would not be enough paper for it. We drank alcohol even before we became humans. Alcohol was and is found in nature in its natural state. 4 billion years ago, when life was just beginning. Single-celled microorganisms floating in the primordial soup absorbed simple sugars and released ethanol and carbon dioxide. That is, in essence, they peed beer. 10 million years ago. Our ancestors climbed down from the trees. Why? It is an open question. It is quite possible that they were attracted by the wonderful overripe fruits that littered the forest floor. Such fruits contain more sugar and alcohol. Accordingly, we developed a sense of alcohol, the ability to detect its smell from a distance. Where there is alcohol, there is sugar that we assimilated. Once we got used to the taste of alcohol, it was time to move on to the next evolutionary stage, to develop a mechanism for his splitting. Just 10 million years ago, we experienced a certain gene mutation that allowed us to cope with ethanol. This mutation is associated with the production of a certain enzyme. Man, or his ancestor, received an unexpected opportunity to outdrink all other animals. In modern Homo sapiens, 10% of liver enzymes are responsible for converting alcohol into energy. Sumerian drinking establishments. The civilization developed at the end of the 4th millennium BC in what is now Iraq, in Sumer. It was beer that people began to write about first and foremost. These primitive records are nothing more than promissory notes. But there were no coins back then. People paid with barley, gold, and beer. Initially, somewhere around 3200 BC. People first drew a picture of a conical beer vessel, in order to write about everything they considered important, that is, mainly about gods and beer. And also about Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, who was engaged in its eternal and endless brewing. One of the hymns in her honor tells how she rakes the malt with a large shovel, how she dries it in an oven, how she soaks it in vessels, how she adds wort, honey, wine, and so on and so forth. Everyone drank beer. Rulers on the throne. Priests in the temple. The main thing is that beer was everywhere. It made a person human. It civilized. The Sumerians had a saying, cowardly, as if he doesn't know beer, but another one says much more about them. Not knowing beer is abnormal. How did a simple ordinary Sumerian get drunk? We need a drink. And where should we go? We need a drinking establishment. Taverns already exist. You just need to find the nearest one. We go inside the tavern. The very first impressions are darkness, strong smells, hordes of flies. This is because the beer is brewed directly in the tavern. Beer is made right here. So the tavern smells of malt, barley and other brewing raw materials. When your eyes get used to the semi-darkness a little, the brewing unit itself appears before us. A whole string of different containers, each with a special name. If we came across a fashionable enough establishment, the pottery might be painted. But our tavern, it seems, is not one of those. Taverns have always been run by women. Let's order some beer. The main thing is not to forget Article 108 of the Code of King Hammurabi. If the tavern keeper tries to cheat us, we will inform on her and she will be drowned. The Sumerians had a fairly wide range of beer: barley beer, spelt, brown, dark, light, red, sweet. Beer with honey and other spices, a mixture of strong beer with wine, filtered beer. The last two were very expensive, and it is possible that often only one was available, the beer of the day. And yet, a connoisseur of craft beer would certainly like ancient Each tavern was a mini brewery. In fact, there were no maxi breweries at all. That is, if you want. You can start an endless conversation with the innkeeper about the maltiness of the taste and various brewing subtleties like mashing. Now you need to pay. Regulars are given credit. The payment is taken in barley. So we sit down at the table, they bring us a vessel with beer and 2 straws for it. Beer is drunk through a straw. Because Sumerian beer is not a modern amber transparent nectar. It is more like a foamy barley porridge with a cap of grounds. The straw allows you to get through this cap to the coveted liquid. So, the beer is in front of us, the straws are ready. What now? You can have a competition to see who can outdrink whom. This seems to be a common thing here. Such competitions among the gods are mentioned more than once, so it must be assumed that they were not alien to humans either. Ancient Egypt. Egyptian history was very, very, very long. But the Egyptians drank. That's for sure. The builders of the Cheops pyramid received part of their pay in beer. The tomb of King Scorpio I, buried around 3150 BC, contained 300 jars of imported wine, so the Egyptians certainly had wine. It's very interesting that it was Egyptian women who knew a thing or two about drinking. This was an area where there was a surprisingly modern equality of the sexes. In one depiction of a New Year's feast, the women sit separately from the men, but drink just as much. In fact, there is text that conveys their conversation. The Kabira says, "For your soul's sake, drink until you are drunk. Celebrate. Listen to your kinsman. Don't sit idle. Bring me 18 jars of wine." An old woman demands, "I want to get drunk. Inside, I'm all dry as straw." At an ancient Egyptian feast, even if respectable ladies were present, someone had to make sure you didn't tumble into the Nile or drown in your own vomit. Scenes of drinking are depicted in tombs, because the Egyptians were proud of their drinking. It was not shameful to get drunk to the point of squealing like a pig, and they wanted to immortalize such a noble revelry. Ancient Greece. The Greeks did not drink beer, they drank wine, diluting 1 part of it with 2 or 3 parts of water, so the strength was about the same as beer. The Greeks have this funny habit of complicating everything. However, this was how they ensured the opportunity to indulge in their favorite pastime, because more than anything else in the world, more than philosophy, libations, sculpture, the ancient Greeks loved to despise foreigners. The Persians drink beer, therefore they are barbarians. The Thracians drink wine undiluted, therefore they are also barbarians. Only the Greeks know how to do it right, in the opinion of the Greeks themselves. Dionysus was the Greek god of wine. He is mentioned as early as the 13th century BC and appears in the Iliad. Which means that by the 5th century BC, when Athens became the main center of classical culture, he had already existed for 700 years. The worshippers of the god Dionysians did not like teetotalers. Such an attitude on the part of the god of wine is quite natural, but Dionysus would not be Dionysus if he did not arrange cruel reprisals against them. The most famous example is the play by Euripides, where the king tries to ban Bacchanalia. Dionysus instills in his female admirers that the king is a lion, and the women tear him to shreds. The king's mother leads the angry crowd. Greek mythology demonstrates a strange and very complex attitude to drunkenness. The Sumerians considered drinking a good and unifying thing, the Egyptians considered it an extreme sport, and the Greeks put forward theories and developed strategies. The inhuman Spartans forced slaves to get drunk in front of their children to discourage them from drinking. The Athenians used philosophical methods to find out what degree of intoxication should be achieved and how one should behave when drunk. Thus, drinking in Greece was a mysterious and subtle matter. It was believed that a person should drink and get drunk, but at the same time be aware of his actions. Symposiums, joint male drinking bouts, were held in a special part of the house called andron, which literally meant men's room. Men gathered for symposiums, and they gathered at someone's home, not in a tavern. As a rule, there were about a dozen guests. There were also more crowded gatherings, about 30 people, but rarely. First, they served dinner. A simple, unpretentious treat, which was eaten rather quickly and without unnecessary words. Food is not the main thing. It is needed only to absorb the wine. The Athenians knew how to set priorities. The guests reclined on them, leaning on the pillow, but not all of them. The youngsters were not allowed to lie down. They drank sitting. If the symposium was held in the summer, the wine was cooled by immersing it in a well, burying it in the ground, or, if there was a desire and opportunity to splurge, in imported snow with straw. If there was a very strong desire and opportunity, the wine was also imported. The best wines were delivered from Lesbos. The wine was brought in a huge bowl called a crater, which only 2 slaves could carry. Then another vessel appeared, a hydria, filled with water, which was used to dilute the wine in the crater in a ratio of 3:1. The diluted wine was poured into jugs, and from them, into small portion bowls with 2 handles, to which the guests could finally fall. The main difference between our and the ancient Athenian attitude to drunkenness is that the Athenians got drunk intentionally. At a modern party in Western countries, you can get drunk by accident. You just don't notice how much you've had. There was no accident at the symposia. At the symposia, people got drunk on purpose, consistently, and in public. Everyone was given a cup of wine, which they had to drain to the bottom. Only then would they pour more. Not finishing it was unmanly and considered a breach of propriety. The symposiarch orders you to drink, so we drink. Symposia ended in different ways. You could peacefully go home, or you could not go anywhere, but fall asleep right on the couch, taking advantage of the fact that you were already lying on it. Sometimes they performed a komos. That was the name of the act. When a warmed-up company tumbled out and ran around the street screaming and whooping, deliberately waking up the neighbors. Ancient China. According to ancient Chinese legend, the first wine in China was made by Yi Dai around 2070 BC. He presented his invention to the first Chinese Emperor Yu. Emperor Yu drank it and liked it, but being a wise emperor, he saw that wine would bring terrible troubles and sorrows to the people, so he banned it, and banished Yi Dai, so that he would definitely teach them a lesson. According to archaeology, the oldest known wine, that is, the oldest alcoholic drink that we do not doubt, was found during excavations in the Chinese Jiahu and dated to around 7000 BC. Among the written sources that have come down to us from the first millennium BC, there is a document called the Proclamation Concerning Drunkenness. This document is interesting as confirmation. The Chinese Shang dynasty fell because everyone drank. The authorities actively fought against drunkenness, but judging by the number of decrees prohibiting the consumption of alcohol that were issued in ancient China, it was impossible to achieve any results. After all, no one would prohibit something that does not exist, therefore, mass prohibitions indicate mass drunkenness. The famous philosopher Confucius, in the teachings he preached, considered moderate consumption of alcohol to be vital. The authorities allowed drinking if it was primarily of a ceremonial nature. Rituals, funerals, formal receptions. Accordingly, if you had a desire to get drunk, then nothing was easier. Show up at a protocol ceremony and guzzle everything that is served. The authorities received denunciations of people who went to funerals, trying to drink as much alcohol as possible in exchange for a stingy tear for the deceased. According to legend, somewhere in the depths of the centuries there was a period when people could be executed for drinking more than 5 portions of alcohol. It is known for certain that during the era of the unification of China by the Han Dynasty, a law was passed prohibiting gatherings of more than 3 people for unreasonable drinking of alcohol. The ban in any case worked poorly. An interesting feature in the relationship of the ancient Chinese with alcohol, they did not distinguish between wine and ale. Bible. Noah planted a vine. This was the first thing he did after the flood. And he drank of the wine, and became drunk, and lay naked in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and went out, and told his 2 brothers. Shem and Japheth took a garment, and laid it upon their shoulders, and went backwards, and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. To the eternal chagrin of the Puritans and the grumbling types. The Old Testament is distinguished by its extremely permissive attitude towards drunkenness. Wine, it is always wine, is simply one of the blessings given by God, along with grain, oil, and peace. Any person of any means has a wine press. People drink, people get drunk, and there is nothing wrong with that, as long as the younger generation knows its place. The people of Israel lived in an ideal wine-making area, and brewing beer was not even in their thoughts. Wine, on the contrary, was perceived as an ordinary product, a routine, a way to quench sorrow. Almost all of the 200-odd references to alcohol in the Old Testament are neutral. And finally, there is no mention of taverns or inns in the Old Testament. Not once. And since people were definitely drinking somewhere, it must have been either on the streets or at home, in the company of naked neighbors. Rome. Early Rome was stern and sober. During the heyday of the Republic, the clean-shaven, short-haired, military-disciplined Romans adored water and built giant aqueducts to eternally supply the eternal city with precious moisture. They had wine, but in modest quantities. Women drank even less than men. According to some sources, the founder of Rome, Romulus, instituted the death penalty for women caught drunk. Women were supposed to kiss their relatives when they met, so that they could smell the alcohol. In general, the attitude of the Romans of that period to all these matters is very accurately conveyed by the proverb, "There are 3 evils in the world, night, women and wine." And then Rome became an empire. The Roman Empire was essentially a system in which all the wealth of the known world flowed into a single city. And as a result, it became, probably, the richest in the entire existence of mankind. Wealth corrupts. The more money, the more scope for entertainment, and eventually, decline sets in. The Romans loved wine more than water. Then they allowed women to try wine. And off we go. By the middle of the 1st century AD, the stern senators of the Republican era must have been writhing in their graves. In Rome, if you wanted to taste wine and other benefits, you first had to find yourself a patron in order to acquire them at his expense. There were rich patrons and hangers-on hanging around them. No one hid anything. If you were ready to humiliate yourself for a reward, you got it, in the form of delicious food and good wine. The core of this system was a banquet, a feast called convivium. To get to the feast, first of all, you had to get an invitation. In fact, it was not that difficult. Many rich Romans held feasts every evening. Kitchens and dining rooms were kept in constant readiness. and the host did not have to know all the guests. At the convivium, which literally means community and unity, there was no community in sight. The Romans gathered to show themselves off, to build a hierarchy, to determine who was at the top and who was at the very bottom. There was no entertainment here. It was supposed to know your place, to praise those above you and mock those below you. A variety of hierarchical markers served this purpose: seating, slaves, the quality and quantity of wine, food, the dishes in which the wine was served, and a target at which these dishes were thrown. There was only one table in the banquet hall, albeit a large one. On the right couch they laid the smaller fry. The most insignificant of the guests was placed closest to the free side of the table. This corner, located diagonally from the important host, received worse and simpler dishes and wine, meaning that the guests here were second class. At the feast, each guest was assigned a separate slave, a personal cupbearer, who served only this guest, and no one else. Here the question arises: how good is the slave assigned to you? The Romans judged slaves by beauty. The most handsome young man served the owner. The rest were distributed among the guests in a rank order depending on their external features. The most wretched guest was given the ugliest slave. The first wine critics were the Romans. From what slope, from what grape variety and, most importantly, what year? The Romans valued age above all else in wine. The most valuable wine must be 100 years old. A feast is not entertainment. It is a vanity fair. And if you are the third on the third bed, you will not even be able to sip the wine that the host drains from jugs. You will only hear about it continuation of the history of drunkenness in the Middle Ages, and further in the following videos.